Hey, what's happening? This is Jeff Saxton, and you are here on the Jeff Saxton podcast, Reviving the Fire. And so good to have you on the podcast today. And we're excited to dig into a really cool little excerpt that I want to read to you guys from a guy that tried to disprove the book of Acts. And we're going to find out how well that went. Okay, so if this sounds like something you're interested in, then today's episode is just for you. All right, guys, grab a chair, grab a coffee, something to snack on. Hopefully you're taking care of your health and eating somewhat healthy these days. But regardless how you want to do it, I think today is going to be a really good experience for all of us. And, you know, sometimes we are on the internet looking at things, reading about, you know, everything really, but sometimes we'll hit something about the Bible and somebody will make some claim, and it can be very convincing, you know, one way or the other, actually. But what we want to do is not take anything too quickly. We want to do our research and not just take anybody's word for anything these days, right? And I especially want to encourage you in the day where, you know, everything is spun. It's going to take you to the first 4 or 5 pages of Google to find anything that has any legitimacy to it in general. So be careful and just know sometimes you're going to come upon some things that'll be kind of silly. All right. And, but that's okay. That just helps us strengthen what we know we believe or what we think we believe. But regardless of what you or I believe, there's the truth. And some folks don't care what the truth is. They want to spin truth to fit their goals, their justification for their actions, whatever else. And then there are other folks that just want the truth, and they will adjust their life one way or another to whatever truth they find. So, you know, ask yourself, what place are you in? Now, I'm not going to make anybody feel bad for believing anything. So please feel free, of course, to believe whatever you want to believe. But I hope just do us this favor we ask in the Reviving the Fire podcast is that you would just be open to the truth and be willing to adjust your lifestyle, adjust what you want to be true, or, you know, what is true according to what is brought before you. So today I'm going to bring something before you, and it's kind of interesting. So, but like I said, you know, you can be finding things, and I do all the time, and I know that you guys do too, especially if you're reading your phones late at night. There's a lot of these experiences we'll have, or we'll come across something and it's disproving, you know, God, or disproving the Bible or something like that. And there's a lot of this stuff out there. And, you know, if I weren't as used to dealing with it, it would throw me. And I'm sure it throws some of you. But don't worry, you're going to be unthrown today, okay? But one of I've noticed, actually, I think it's a YouTube video series that is out there quite a bit, has to do with somebody that proposes, and they're good people, they're nice people. I actually thought they did such a good job of starting out the videos that I couldn't tell which side they were on. And again, you know, if something's true, then it's true. If it's not true, then it's not true. Frankly, if you're going to believe the Bible, then you need to believe, or you're going to believe in God, you're going to believe in truth. You need to kind of be a person that is open to anything being proven false or true. Because at the end of the day, all truth is God's truth. All truth leads to God, one way or another. And besides, who wants to believe a lie of any kind? Who wants a spun lie? You know, whenever we do that, we're buying into somebody's agenda that is trying to manipulate you a certain way, and they get something out of it. So there's no other reason to try to spin people other than they want to use you for something, or some material ends, or financial, or some other, you know, motive. But we've got no motives like that today. We just want the truth. So sometimes I'll come upon something and it disproves something that maybe people have believed, or even something that might have been a minor truth in the Bible. We have to approach the Bible like everything else with an open eye and be a little bit skeptical. be a little bit. It's going to help you. Okay. But when you do that, what happens to me anyway is I just get blown away more and more and more with every year that I'm on this earth, how true the Bible really is. And we have to have a little bit of a skeptical person in, or not a person, but a voice in our head that's saying, now, wait a minute, Jeff, I'm not just going to believe that. Like, I'm going to just test this thing. It's called the scientific method. You think something could be true, you doubt it and doubt it and doubt it and test it, and until when you get to the place you cannot doubt it anymore, then it's true. That's the scientific method, correct? All right, so let's do that today. So I came upon this video, and it was hilarious because they started talking about how, the New Testament writers, starting with the gospel writers, whoever the people were that actually wrote the first 4 gospels, whoever the people were that actually wrote the letters of Paul and the letters of John, etc., whoever those people were. Now there was a person that had a podcast, and then he was interviewing a quote expert, and the expert was supposedly represented, that time of the history of the world 2,000 years ago, how people wrote down history, how they recorded history, what historians did at that time. And this person began to talk about how it was well known in 2,000 years ago that it was typical for Jewish history people or the Jewish community of historians at that time to talk about things, and they were telling truths, but in kind of a parable form, almost to say, of course, you and I know that Jesus used parables, but this lady was saying that everything is a parable, even the historical, quote, historical things, the listing the towns or the places that the person lived, or, if they had 3 sons and 1 daughter, or if, or all the details that you read about in the Gospels and in the entire New Testament. She started saying this was a typical way back then that they described something that was real or true to them, is to make up a bunch of facts, that would seem they weren't really true, but that they were used for something that was truthful. And again, she had a bunch of degrees, and she teaches some college somewhere, professor somewhere, has some doctorate somewhere, and it was very convincing. And I'm sure if people were watching that, they would have meant, wow, I'm starting to realize that maybe the New Testament and maybe these Gospels aren't really factual, And but the fact is, I've studied this for a while. I know very well Jewish history, and if nothing else, I just realized, I have a few books written by Josephus. He's one of the most popular Jewish writers, historians at that time that was not a Christian. And Josephus was known as a excellent historian, maybe the most excellent historian that we've got in 2,000 years ago. And he didn't do that. Like when he was talking about, in fact, the Antiquities of Josephus is several works where he's listing historical fact after historical fact. And I'm thinking, there's no parable style writing in there. And basically, she was just playing on the ignorance of people that don't know these things. Number 2, having, gone to Bible college, not that alone means anything, but having studied the Bible for 30 some years of ministry, I realized she was just hoping people wouldn't investigate this and just take her word for it and just start going, oh yeah, this was all made up. It's not true. Now, they may really believe that, and they're just trying to help people, so I'm going to give her the benefit of the doubt. But the fact is, there has been over many years and decades, there is always people trying to disprove the Bible, of course, throughout history. And like I said, I think in order for us to know what we believe, we've got to start out and doubt it ourselves a little bit. So when someone makes a claim, we need to go, okay, now I know that this isn't true, but you know what? I'm just going to once again test if what this person's saying is true or not. So I went ahead and just did a brief study about other very famous archaeologists and historians and what they've found about the Bible, if they agree with this lady. And that's just something I like to do. So I did some of this, so you won't have to do some of the research, but I actually encourage you to go read about, but I'm just going to do one person today. There's many people, but around 100 years ago, there was a very, very well-known biblical archaeologist, and in fact, he had the highest post in Oxford, Edinburgh. They say the highest post in London, in England, in all of Great Britain. And he was appointed by the regent, who the queen herself, queen and king at that time, wasn't a Queen Elizabeth, who they appointed. So he was appointed by the very crown, the king and queen of England, this regent, and he placed this guy, Mr. William Mitchell Ramsay. So Sir William Mitchell Ramsay was born. Ramsay, maybe he's related to Gordon Ramsay, the chef, I don't know. But in 1851, he was born, and then he died just at the beginning of World War II. So he could have known Queen Elizabeth's father when he was king. Who knows? But the point is, he began to rise in his understanding of New Testament archaeology, history, and was considered in his day the foremost authority on Asia Minor. Now, Asia Minor is the place where a lot of the New Testament happened, especially the many of Paul's letters and the book of Acts. Basically, there's 2 or 3 journeys of Paul and a bunch of his missionaries. That's really what the book of Acts is, a series of missionary journeys that the church of Jerusalem, possibly Antioch as well, sent Paul and a bunch of his compadres. They sent them on these missions. It was like they were short-term missions, except their short-term missions were like for 1, 2, or 3 years. And they weren't like, you couldn't get on a plane, of course, at that time. They had to do this by boat, by ships. So the stories of these missionary journeys are told all through the book of Acts. And if you want corroboration, many of the letters that Paul writes to the Romans, to the Ephesians, to the Thessalonians were actually the same people after these missionary journeys, when he followed up with the people that came to know Jesus, and they became involved in a church that Paul helped set up for a couple of years, and then he would leave and go somewhere else and help a church start, and then he would leave, and he would end up writing these people. Okay, so the letters we have are because Paul wrote a letter. Now, Paul never wrote his letters. He had someone else write it for him, and they sent it. But these letters they were kind of passed around like a magazine. I mean, they were kind of like something that he wouldn't write to every single person, but he'd send to somebody who would go to that area, and everyone would take turns reading it. So it was just kind of a cool way for Paul to encourage the church and the people there. Now, for some reason, the book of Acts, I find, is it's a fantastic book. And just so you know, in the New Testament, the last 27 books of the Bible are the New Testament. First 39 are the Old Testament, the Old Covenant. The Old Testament was written hundreds and hundreds of years and completed really hundreds of years before the New Testament, of course, because we have after Christ where the New Testament started. But the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts, you may or may not know, were written by the same person. And in fact, he was the only Gentile to ever write a book of the Bible, Luke. And also, if you've ever read Luke or the book of Acts, they both start out of where Luke greets Theophilus, his friend, and says, I'm writing you about everything that I experienced and saw Jesus do. Now, how he says it in the book Gospel of Luke is the things that he's heard and the eyewitnesses he talked to. Luke did not know Christ personally. So the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of Mark are not from firsthand disciples, because neither Mark nor Luke were the 12 disciples of Jesus. They became disciples after Jesus died and rose again, and the church started, okay? Most likely, Mark was mentored and discipled by Peter, So Mark heard directly from Peter all these stories about Jesus. So when Mark wrote his gospel, he didn't write it as an eyewitness. He wasn't trying to fake anybody out. He was very clear in telling these stories. And you'll notice that it's the shortest gospel. And you'll also notice that some of the details are left out. Well, that's because he wasn't an eyewitness. He was kind of giving it a historical account. And there's a reason why I'm bringing all this up. These are things you need to know to arm yourself with the truth. But we have Matthew, and we have the Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel of John, and those two, of course, were from two of the original 12 disciples. Now, Matthew and John were actually two very interesting and important disciples for us today when we look at history of the church, history of Christianity. Without Matthew's Gospel and without John's Gospel, a ton of what we know would be lost. Both those guys were there, so when they're saying Jesus went here and here and here, they were with him. But even then, not everything just one thing about error. I'm going off to a side here, and we'll come back to our point for today, which is this guy who is trying to disprove the book of Acts. So keep in mind that when you have 12 disciples, 12 different people watching the same event, they say in investigative work, when people are investigating, a situation, let's say, even a traffic accident, and they're trying to figure out what happened, they'll get eyewitnesses. Or let's take the Titanic sinking, okay? Let's take that. Only a few hundred people ever eyewitnessed the Titanic sinking. So we've only got those couple hundred people to find out firsthand what happened. How did the Titanic sink? Exactly. What happened minute by minute. And they say that you don't expect everybody to tell the exact same detail and be exactly accurate. You don't expect that because in eyewitnesses, if that happens, then they know there had to have been some type of collusion or some type of memorizing of a certain set of, because it can't be exact. If it's exact, that shows fraud, possible fraud. So when people interview, they're thinking they're going to hear the same kind of story, but there has to be some little minor details that are different, so that they know that each person actually saw exactly what they said, because everybody's going to see their little side of things. So if things line up exactly, then it actually starts to make it suspect. Does that make sense? So when people are, and in fact, even when my wife and I were getting ready to be married, or we were married, but we were trying to help her get her green card because she's from another country, we had to be interviewed by people that give the green card or not. And when they asked us both every little question about the other person, in general we lined up, but there were a few things where we got off a little different, and they said that was no big deal. That just showed them that we were two real people, and we passed. They allowed us to go. But if we would have gave the exact same point for point, as if we pre-memorized all these points so that it would sound like we were married when we weren't, they would have saw through that. Does that make sense? So when people are trying to disprove the Bible, they always throw that one out. Oh, there's errors in Matthew, errors in John. How many was it? 2 people or 3 people? Well, actually, if they both saw something different, that actually proves that more legitimate than illegitimate that the gospel is correct historically, because these guys are not writing what was historically accurate from, an overview of how you and I would look at it today. They were writing their eyewitness version of it, how they saw it. And so it actually makes it all the more real when some of the fine details may have been slightly different the way they saw it. Not only that, there are some people that when they were watching the Titanic, a few people claimed that it broke in 2 and then went into the waters. But the vast majority of them said that it was stated they didn't see it break in 2. So did it break in 2 because 2 people say it did, or because 200 people say it didn't? Does it mean those 2 people were wrong? It could, or it could mean that they perhaps were looking at it from a certain vantage point, or maybe on their exact angle, with who knows what they were seeing, and maybe it looked like that to them. Either way, they weren't trying to be inaccurate. They're trying to be authentically honest with what they think they saw. When you're trying to spin something and try to fool people, you're going to memorize something to make sure that everybody lands in every single detail the same, kind of a memorized speech type thing. But then that begins to show that it's probably not real. Now, the book of Acts is the second of a two-part volume that the gospel writer of Luke wrote. And Luke was a follower of Paul. Luke was not with the 12 disciples, and Luke became a Christian probably during one of the first missionary journeys with Paul. Luke was a doctor, but he's very detailed, and when you read both the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts, one of the things that slams you right upside the face is the amount of detail he talks about as if he's a historian, and lists details that if they're not real, he's a liar, But the book of Acts was kind of doubted. And even in the church, even in Christian circles, even in the 19th and 20th century, still, people weren't really sure about the book of Acts. Now there are those that are Christians, and, when you read something and the Holy Spirit gives you that revelation that, man, this is true, that really is enough for you. It should be. But today we're talking about, hey, let's doubt something and let's see if we can prove it just factually. Also. And now we've got a man that was not just an archaeologist, he was the premier archaeologist of his day. He was the Regius Professor of Humanities in Aberdeen, and he also was a scholar. He'd written over 20 books. He was one of the most brilliant minds, and pretty much whatever he said about archaeology, people believed. He was a very good archaeologist, and like I said, a New Testament scholar without peer. Pretty much everyone would go to him for any question, certainly about the book of Acts. So when it came to the book of Acts, and everyone went to William Ramsey, they said, it's not real, right? These things can't be true. And now, not only that, he was also a lawyer. He was born to a house of lawyers, 3 generations of lawyers. So he's going to apply all these skills. So he was going to disprove, and even claims in one of his books, he claims that he was not neutral. When he went out to see these places that Luke talked about in Asia Minor, he actually investigated them. I think in some cases even went physically, but for sure he investigated for like decades, for years, every single fact that Luke claimed in the book of Acts, because he was going to release a paper on how he didn't believe it was a good historical document, and he believed that Luke was kind of a lazy archaeologist that we should not trust. We can't trust. In fact, he says, I may fairly claim to have entered into the investigation without any prejudice in favor of the conclusion which I will now attempt to justify to the reader. No, I actually began with an unfavorable mind to it, for the ingenuity and apparent completeness of the Tübingen theory at one time had been quite convincing to me. That Tübingen theory was convinced that Acts was a 2nd century composition written by someone else and not Luke. So even though Luke's saying he's writing it, the Tübingen theory was that someone else wrote it and it wasn't Luke, and it's not legitimate. But after years of investigating every single detail, he retraced the places mentioned in Acts. He began to discover that these were real places, and even met some people, and even found some physical locations that were exactly right on the money. Like there was some tax people, there were some politicians in some of the towns, and he found that these people actually were legit people that had that position at that time in the world. When he found enough of these truths over and over again in smaller towns and certain places and things, people, he wrote a paper called St. Paul the Traveler on the Roman Citizen, and he changed his mind 180 and decided that Luke had to be one of the greatest historians that he'd ever read. And I'm going to quote, Luke was among historians of first rank. At the end of his life, and even at the end of his teaching, he began to teach the opposite, that Acts is totally a sound and legitimate historical piece, and is so untrue what this quote expert said, that the Jewish tradition, or the tradition 2,000 years ago, was to make up facts to make something be true, like a parable, And on that point, I will kind of bring this down for landing with this, is that when you read, let's just say Matthew, or Luke, let's just say Luke. When you read Luke's gospel, which I've read many times, and you'll notice that Luke is not written to a Jewish audience. Luke was written to a non-Jewish audience. Well, Luke was not a Jew. He was a Gentile. Number one. Number two, he was with Paul. So, Paul was apostle to the Gentiles. Peter was the apostle to the Jews. So we would not expect Luke to be an expert in Jewish tradition. We'd expect him to be an expert in the things he was an expert in and claimed to be. We would expect him to write a first-hand account of Acts. So in some of those experiences, it says we. So Luke was claiming that on some of these experiences in the book of Acts, he was with Paul. Okay. So, but it's important to note that the Gospel of Luke was not to a Jewish audience. It was to a Gentile audience. Matthew, on the other hand, is a very Jewish audience, and tons of things in there that are for Jewish people. That's why when you read it, there are unique things about Matthew that are not in any other gospel. Well, of course, because Matthew was writing to a Jewish audience on purpose. He wanted to convince Jewish people that Jesus was the Messiah. But Luke was not concerned about that. He was trying to share to a non-Jewish audience that Jesus was the Son of God, but not the Messiah, because they didn't care about the Messiah. But they certainly care about the Son of God. They cared about if Jesus was legitimately, God's son, and he had all this power and he did all these miracles. That convinces Gentiles. Jewish people needed to know he was the Messiah. Okay, too much segue, but just keep that in mind. Now, when we talk about Luke and what he's trying to accomplish, he was very, very, very detailed. But again, just to understand, he was the only Gentile writer. But when he listed things that happened, it was very, very accurate. Now, when he talked about Jesus talking about in parables, this is true of all the Gospels, but especially in the Gospel of Luke. I mean, it doesn't take more than a first grade education, maybe a kindergarten education, to read these parables. And Jesus will say, a man was walking in a field and he bought this thing, and then all this happened, and even if that's not convincing enough, we have the response of the audience. Many times they would ask him questions, and these are recorded in the Gospels. Hey, why do you always talk to us in parables? Why don't you tell us straight? Why are you telling us things in parables all the time? And then Jesus answered them, because he revealed these things in parables so that the simplest person, even the uneducated, could understand kingdom truths and really grasp them. And so he didn't just want, quote, the educated. He wanted everyone to understand this stuff. So that's one reason he would use parables. The other reason is some of these concepts are kind of hard to grasp, and education doesn't necessarily help at all. You guys know some educated people can be some of the most common sense lacking people in the world, right? So, excuse me, I got a little nose thing. Wow. I get allergies. So that's really an important point, and something that we need to realize, that everyone listening to Jesus in the book of Luke knew exactly when he was telling a parable to illustrate truth, and when something that Luke described actually happened factually, just like the book of Acts. Everyone knows, this historian knows, William Ramsey. So anyone that says they're an expert in Jewish historical writing knows that this is, I'm sorry, but baloney. They're just spinning it to trip some of you up. Now, maybe they have a reason. Maybe they got a grudge against Christian people. That's understandable. I have too had that myself. So, but that doesn't mean we throw the baby out with the bathwater. That doesn't mean that Christianity was wrong. That just means that there are imperfect people in Christianity just like you and me. So, as for the sources, as for the New Testament, it is very historically accurate, and apparently maybe one of the most historically accurate things we ever, of any document we have of that time, 2,000 years ago, or even sooner than that. I mean, the historical accuracy of your New Testament is without precedent. It is absolutely mind-blowing how accurate your Bible is sitting there. So this is just another talk of how confident you can be in your Bible that you're holding. There are some translation issues. There are some things to talk about, and we do that. We will do that in this podcast. There's some things that not every single exact thing in every single Bible is clear and needs to be talked about and explained. But that's our job. And I hope you guys feel encouraged today and know that you can trust your New Testament, trust your gospel writer, Luke, the only Gentile author of any of the books in the New Testament, and a pretty good one, if not fantastic one. And you've got all these experts to say so. That's all the time we have today, guys. I hope you have an awesome week, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.